Mark stares at the memo cutting his overtime pay by 20% while his foreclosure notice sits unopened in his truck. 30 days to save the only home his son has ever known. If you've ever felt powerless against corporate greed, hit like and subscribe. The warehouse office felt smaller tonight, its walls pressing in as the last of the day's shift workers clocked out. Mark Henderson sat hunched over his desk, the steady hum of conveyor belts and sorting machines creating a mechanical symphony that had become the soundtrack of his life. The overhead lights buzzed with that familiar flicker, casting harsh shadows across stacks of shipping manifests and overtime requests that would never be approved. His computer screen glowed with the email that had arrived at 6:47 p.m., 17 minutes after his shift should have ended. But Mark had learned long ago that Nexacorp didn't respect the concept of quitting time. The subject line read, "Policy Update, Compensation Adjustments," and the corporate jargon couldn't mask what it really meant. Another slice taken from paychecks that were already razor-thin. Due to operational efficiency requirements, overtime compensation will be reduced by 20%, effective immediately. Mark read the words 3 times, each pass driving the reality deeper into his chest like a physical blow. 20%. The number rolled around in his mind, calculating and recalculating the mathematics of survival. Rent, utilities, groceries, Timmy's school supplies. Every dollar already accounted for, stretched to its breaking point. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet, fingers finding the worn leather that had softened with years of handling. Inside, tucked behind his driver's license, was a photograph that had seen better days. The woman in the picture smiled back at him with eyes full of hope and dreams that would never be fulfilled. Emma. Her name still caught in his throat sometimes. Even 2 years after the cancer had taken her, they had bought the house together on Maple Street when Timmy was just 2 years old. Emma had stood in the empty living room, her hand resting on her rounded belly. She was pregnant again then, though they would lose that baby in the 5th month, and declared it perfect. "This is where we'll grow old together," she had said, spinning in a circle with her arms outstretched. "This is where Timmy will bring his friends, where we'll host birthday parties and Christmas mornings." The memory hit him like it always did, sharp and sudden. Emma fighting through chemotherapy, treatments, her hair gone, but her determination fierce. "Promise me," she had whispered during one of her last lucid moments, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll keep the house. It's Timmy's anchor. Don't let them take his home." Mark had promised. He had held her hand and sworn that no matter what happened, Timmy would always have that house, that stability, that foundation Emma had believed so desperately they needed to provide. But promises, Mark was learning, were fragile things when faced with corporate efficiency and bottom-line thinking. At home, Timmy would be finishing his homework at the kitchen table, probably humming one of those songs he learned in music class. 8 years old, and still believing the world was fundamentally fair, that hard work was rewarded, that fathers could fix anything. Mark closed his eyes and tried to imagine how he would explain this to his son. How do you tell a child that the company his father works for, the place that takes up 12 hours of every day, sees them as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet? The mathematics of their situation played out in his mind like a cruel equation. The overtime pay that was being cut represented nearly $400 a month. $400 that meant the difference between making the mortgage payment and joining the ranks of families who had discovered that in America, you could work full-time and still lose everything. Mark's stomach clenched as he thought about the envelope sitting in his truck, the one he had been too afraid to open for 3 days now. First National Bank had been sending increasingly urgent letters, and Mark knew that tonight's would contain the words he had been dreading: final notice. The foreclosure process that he had been fighting with payment plans and desperate phone calls was entering its final phase. He pushed back from his desk, the chair wheels squeaking against the concrete floor. The weight of failure settled into his bones, a heaviness that seemed to increase with each passing day. 2 years of fighting to keep his head above water, 2 years of believing that if he just worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, everything would work out. Mark gathered his things and headed for the exit, his footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. Tomorrow he would have to make a choice: open that envelope and face whatever ultimatum waited inside, or continue living in the dangerous comfort of denial. He pushed through the heavy metal doors into the parking lot, the cool evening air hit his face, and Mark realized that denial was a luxury he could no longer afford. The break room at Nexacorp had seen better days. Stained carpet tiles and mismatched chairs surrounded a table scarred by years of frustrated employees venting their grievances over lukewarm coffee and stale donuts. The smell of burnt coffee hung heavy in the air, a bitter backdrop to what Mark knew would be another exercise in corporate doublespeak. 12 warehouse workers filed in for the mandatory Monday morning meeting, their faces bearing the exhaustion that came from working jobs that demanded everything and gave back as little as legally possible. Mark took a seat near the back, his stomach still churning from the weekend he'd spent avoiding the foreclosure envelope that remained unopened on his kitchen counter at MR. Johnson strode in precisely at 8 a.m., his pressed shirt and polished shoes, a stark contrast to the work boots and faded uniforms of the men who actually moved the freight that kept Nexacorp profitable. He was a man who had climbed the corporate ladder by viewing efficiency as the highest virtue and human concerns as obstacles to quarterly profits. "Gentlemen," Johnson began, not bothering to sit down, "I trust you've all reviewed the compensation adjustment memo. These changes are necessary to maintain our competitive edge in an increasingly challenging market." The words felt rehearsed, delivered with the cold precision of someone who had never worried about choosing between groceries and utilities. Mark's hands clenched in his lap as he watched his co-workers shift uncomfortably in their seats. These were good men, fathers and husbands who showed up every day, who worked through injuries and missed family dinners to keep the warehouse running. "Questions?" Johnson asked, though his tone suggested he neither expected nor wanted any. Mark felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct told him to stay quiet, to keep his head down like he had for the past 2 years. But Emma's voice echoed in his memory, not just her deathbed promise about the house, but something she used to say when they watched the news together. "Someone has to speak up, Mark. If good people stay silent, nothing ever changes." He stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. "Mr. Johnson, with respect, these cuts are going to hurt families. Some of us can't make our rent without that overtime pay." The words came out steadier than he felt, but he could hear the desperation underneath. Several co-workers nodded slightly, though none spoke up to support him. That Johnson's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile became more fixed, more corporate. "Mark, isn't it? Let me be clear about something. Nexacorp is not a charity organization. We pay competitive wages for the work performed. If that compensation doesn't meet your personal, financial planning needs, perhaps you should consider developing additional marketable skills." The condescension in his voice made Mark's jaw clench. "Sir, we're already working 12-hour shifts. When exactly are we supposed to develop these additional skills? And what about the guys with families? When do they see their kids?" "That's not Nexacorp's concern," Johnson replied, his tone growing colder. "We're running a business, not a social services program. Now, if there are no other questions about actual work-related matters, there are 23 families represented. In this room," Mark pressed on, surprising himself with his boldness. 23 men who show up every day, who've made this company millions in profits. Doesn't that count for something?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mark could feel his co-workers' discomfort, their fear that his defiance might somehow splash onto them. In the corporate world of Nexacorp, solidarity was a luxury that could cost you your job. Johnson stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Let me make this crystal clear for you, Mark. You have exactly two choices. Take the job as it's offered, or clean out your locker. There's a line of people waiting for your position who won't waste my time with sob stories about their personal financial decisions. If you've ever faced a workplace bully who holds your livelihood hostage, smash that like button and subscribe. Because this story is about to show you that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can bring down the biggest tyrants." The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Mark looked around the room at faces that wouldn't meet his eyes, at men who had families and mortgages and fears just like his. He understood their silence. In a world where jobs were scarce and bills were constant, heroism was a luxury most couldn't afford. "Meeting dismissed," Johnson said, gathering his papers with the satisfied air of a man who had just reminded everyone exactly who held the PowerPoint 3 miles away. Jefferson Elementary's cafeteria buzzed with the controlled chaos of 200 Children navigating the complex social dynamics of lunch period. The long tables were divided by invisible but well-understood boundaries. The popular kids near the windows, the quiet ones along the walls, and scattered throughout. The children who didn't quite fit anywhere. Lily Chen sat alone at the end of a table, her small hands folded in her lap as she watched other children unwrap sandwiches and trade snacks. Her lunch account had been forgotten again, not because her family couldn't afford it, but because her mother's assistant had been instructed to handle non-essential scheduling. And somehow her daughter's nutrition had fallen into that category. Tears pricked at the corners of Lily's eyes as her stomach growled audibly. She had learned not to ask the lunch ladies for help after the embarrassing incident 2 weeks ago when they'd called the main office to verify her account status, leading to a 10-minute delay that made every child in line stare at her with a mixture of pity and impatience. Timmy Henderson navigated through the maze of tables with his brown paper lunch bag, the same one his father packed every morning with the methodical care of someone who understood that these small gestures of love mattered. He had been heading toward his usual spot with Jake and Marcus when he noticed the girl with the long black hair sitting by herself, her shoulders shaking slightly. He didn't think about it. Thinking would have introduced doubt, and doubt would have led to the kind of paralysis that adults seem to suffer from when faced with others' pain. Instead, Timmy simply walked over and sat down across from her. "Hey," he said quietly, "are you okay?" Lily looked up, startled. Most kids ignored her, and the few who noticed usually did so to point out that she was crying or eating alone. "I'm fine," she whispered, the lie obvious to anyone who cared to look. Timmy opened his lunch bag and pulled out his peanut butter and jelly sandwich, cut diagonally the way his father knew he preferred. Without hesitation, he slid half across the table toward her. "My dad always packs too much," he said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "You want some? It's grape jelly, the good kind, not the stuff that tastes like medicine." Lily stared at the sandwich half as if it were some kind of miracle. "I can't. I don't have anything to trade." "You don't need to trade," Timmy said, already biting into his remaining half. "My mom used to say that food tastes better when you share it with someone nice." The mention of his mother was casual, practiced. Timmy had learned to speak about Emma in past tense without the conversation becoming about death and sadness. Lily picked up the sandwich tentatively, taking a small bite that seemed to awaken her entire face. "Your mom sounds smart," she said. She was. She got sick and died when I was 6, but she taught me lots of good stuff first." Timmy swung his legs under the table, completely matter-of-fact about a tragedy that would have broken most adults. "What about your mom? Does she pack your lunch?" Lily shook her head. "She works a lot. At some big company with numbers and meetings. Sometimes she doesn't come home until after I'm asleep. That's hard," Timmy said with the simple empathy that children possess before the world teaches them to complicate their compassion. "My dad works a lot too, but he's always there when I need him. Maybe your mom doesn't know you need her more." The conversation continued as they shared the sandwich, two 8-year-olds navigating the complex territory of loneliness and connection. Neither realized that this simple act of kindness, one child sharing his lunch with another, would set in motion a chain of events that would transform multiple lives. That evening, Mark sat at his kitchen table under the circle of light cast by a single lamp, bills spread before him like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. Timmy was upstairs, supposedly doing homework, but probably reading comic books under his covers with a flashlight. The mathematics of survival had become Mark's nightly ritual. Mortgage payment, $1, $2.47. Utilities, $1.56. Groceries, $2.80 if he was careful. Car payment, $1.98. Insurance, gas, Timmy's school expenses. The numbers marched across the page in neat columns that added up to more than his reduced paycheck could cover. He pulled out his calculator and ran the numbers again, hoping that somehow the mathematics would change, that the 20% cut in overtime wouldn't create the impossible gap it had created the previous 19 times he'd calculated it. Mark opened his laptop and browsed the local classified ads with growing desperation. Weekend security guard positions, evening restaurant shifts, early morning delivery routes, anything that might bridge the gap between income and survival. But every option meant less time with Timmy, and Mark had already sacrificed too many school plays and bedtime stories to Nexacorp's demands. His eyes fell on a small pile of items he'd gathered from around the house. Emma's jewelry, his old guitar, a watch his father had given him when he graduated high school. Each piece represented memories he wasn't ready to lose, but memories wouldn't pay the mortgage. The foreclosure envelope sat unopened beside the bills, its presence a constant reminder. That denial had an expiration date. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would have to face whatever ultimatum waited inside and figure out how to explain to his 8-year-old son that sometimes, even when you work as hard as you can, it isn't enough. Friday evening hit Mark like a physical blow. 12 hours of loading trucks, moving pallets, and dodging Mr. Johnson's increasingly hostile glances had left him hollowed out, his body running on fumes and determination. The overtime cuts meant working longer shifts for the same desperate pay, a mathematical impossibility that Nexacorp seemed determined to enforce through sheer willpower and threats. The walk from his truck to the front door felt endless. The pavement beneath his feet was cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through the gaps like tiny declarations of surrender. Mark's work boots scuffed against the concrete as he fumbled for his keys, his hands trembling from exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep fear that had been growing for weeks. That's when he saw it. The envelope was taped to his front door. With the aggressive efficiency of someone who wanted to ensure it couldn't be missed or ignored. Even in the dim light of the flickering porch bulb, the red ink seemed to glow with malevolent purpose. Final notice: foreclosure proceedings. Mark's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the porch steps, the concrete cold and unforgiving against his back as he stared at the document that represented the end of everything he had promised Emma he would protect. His hands shook as he tore open the envelope, the paper crinkling like dried leaves in his grip. 30 days, he whispered to the empty street. 30 days to come up with $3,247 in missed payments and fees, or lose the house forever. The red ink glared up at him under the flickering porch light, each word a nail in the coffin of his dreams. Mark closed his eyes and saw Timmy's bedroom, the baseball glove on the nightstand, the drawings of their family taped to the walls, the small wooden toy chest that Emma had painted by hand when Timmy was 3. All of it would be gone. All of it would belong to strangers who would never understand the love that had filled these rooms. He sat there on the steps for 20 minutes, the foreclosure notice crumpled in his fists, before he finally found the strength to go inside and pretend everything was normal for Timmy's sake. Saturday morning brought unexpected relief in the form of children's laughter. Mark was in the kitchen, staring at his laptop screen and a dozen rejected job applications, when Timmy burst through the front door with a small girl trailing behind him. "Dad, this is Lily," Timmy announced with the casual confidence of an 8-year-old who had just solved one of life's great problems. "She's my friend from school. Can she stay for a while?" Lily Chen stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in the modest living room with its mismatched furniture and family photos covering every available surface. She was dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Mark made in a week, but her expression held none of the judgment he might have expected from a child of privilege. "It's nice to meet you, Lily," Mark said, closing his laptop and forcing a smile. "Of course you can stay. Are you hungry? I think we have some juice boxes in the fridge." What followed was a masterclass in childhood resilience. Timmy gave Lily the grand tour of their small house with the pride of someone showing off a mansion. He pointed out the chip in the kitchen wall where he'd once thrown a baseball, the family photos that chronicled better times, and the living room where they built pillow forts on rainy days. "This is where my mom used to read to me," Timmy said, patting the worn couch cushions. "Dad says she had the best storytelling voice in the whole world." Lily listened with rapt attention, her fingers trailing along the furniture as if she were touching something magical. "Your house feels happy," she said quietly. "Like people really live here." Within an hour, the living room had been transformed into an elaborate fort constructed from couch cushions, blankets, and dining room chairs. Mark watched from the kitchen as the two children disappeared into their creation, their voices mixing in the kind of innocent conspiracy that only childhood friends could share. "Your dad seems really nice." Lily's voice drifted from inside the fort. "He's the best dad ever," Timmy replied without hesitation. "Even when he's tired from work, He still helps me with my homework and comes to my baseball games. He says I'm more important than anything else in the whole world." There was a pause, and when Lily spoke again, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. "My mom works at this really big company. She's always busy with meetings and phone calls and computer stuff. Sometimes I don't see her for days, even though we live in the same house." "What kind of company?" Timmy asked. "I don't really know. She talks about numbers and making sure things run efficiently. She has this huge office with windows that look out over the whole city. But she's never home for dinner, and she forgets about my school stuff a lot." Mark felt his heart clench as he listened to this 8-year-old girl casually describe a level of parental neglect that no child should have to endure. He thought about all the nights he'd worked late at Nexacorp, all the times he'd been too exhausted to properly listen to Timmy's stories about school. Was he failing his son the same way Lily's mother was failing her? "That sounds lonely," Timmy said with the directness that only children possessed. "But maybe she doesn't know you need her more. Adults sometimes forget that kids need them around, not just their money." The wisdom in his 8-year-old son's words hit Mark like a physical blow. How had this little boy, who had lost his mother and was about to lose his home, developed such clarity about what really mattered in life? 20 miles across the city, Susan Chin sat in her sterile corporate apartment, bathed in the blue glow of her laptop screen. The penthouse was everything a successful CEO was supposed to want: floor-to-ceiling windows with a stunning city view, designer furniture that had never been properly lived in, and a kitchen that remained perpetually spotless because she survived primarily on takeout and corporate catering. She had been working since 6 a.m., responding to emails, reviewing quarterly projections, and preparing for Monday's board meeting. The numbers were good. Profits up 18%, overhead costs slashed by nearly 20% thanks to the recent operational adjustments. On paper, Nexacorp was thriving. The sound of her daughter's key in the lock barely registered. Susan had trained herself to work through distractions, and Lily's comings and goings had become just another part of the background noise of her efficient life. "Mom," Lily's voice cut through the hum of the laptop fan. Susan murmured, not looking up from her screen. "How was your playdate, sweetheart?" But Lily didn't give her usual one-word response. Instead, she practically bounced into the living room, her face glowing with an excitement Susan hadn't seen in months. "Mom, you have to hear about Timmy. He's my new best friend, and he's amazing, and his dad is so nice. And they have this house where they build pillow forts and eat dinner together every night. And Timmy says his dad comes to all his baseball games even when he's really tired from work." The words tumbled out in a rush of 8-year-old enthusiasm, and Susan found herself actually looking up from her laptop for the first time in hours. When was the last time Lily had spoken to her with such unfiltered joy? "That sounds wonderful, honey," Susan said, trying to refocus on her emails. "I'm glad you made a friend. But Mom, you don't understand. Timmy's dad works at this big company, and he's always tired, but he still makes time for Timmy. And their house isn't fancy, but it feels like a real family lives there. They have pictures everywhere, and you can tell they actually spend time together." Something in Lily's tone made Susan pause. There was a wistfulness there, a longing that cut through her CEO armor and hit something deeper. What happened next would connect two worlds that had never touched. "What company does Timmy's father work for?" Susan asked, though she wasn't sure why the question mattered. Lily shrugged. "I don't know. But Timmy says his dad works really hard to take care of him. And that family is the most important thing. He says his mom used to tell him that before she died." The word "died" hung in the air between them, and Susan felt something shift in her chest. Here was this child who had lost his mother, whose father was struggling to provide for him, and yet Timmy radiated the kind of security and love that her own daughter seemed to crave. "Tell me more about Timmy's family," Susan said, closing her laptop for the first time all day. The next morning, Susan found herself in a position she hadn't experienced in over a decade, sitting at her breakfast table without her laptop open, actually listening to her daughter talk about school. Lily chattered about her new friendship with Timmy, her eyes bright in a way that made Susan realize how long it had been since she'd seen her daughter truly happy. "He's so nice, Mom. When I was sad about forgetting my lunch money, he just gave me his sandwich without even thinking about it. And his dad picks him up from school every day, even when he's really tired from work." Susan sipped her coffee, trying to process the gentle reproach hidden in her daughter's innocent words. When was the last time she had picked Lily up from school? When was the last time she'd known if her daughter had lunch money or not? Tell me more about his father, Susan said, closing the newspaper she usually read during breakfast. Timmy says his dad works really hard at some big company, but he still comes to all his baseball games. And they have dinner together every night, and his dad helps him with homework even when he's super tired. Lily paused, her voice growing smaller. Do you think my dad would have done stuff like that if he hadn't moved away? The question hit Susan like a physical blow. Lily's father had left when she was 4, citing Susan's workaholic tendencies and emotional unavailability as reasons their marriage couldn't survive. At the time, Susan had convinced herself that providing financial security was more important than the messy complications of emotional presence. I'm sure he would have, sweetheart, Susan said, though the words felt hollow. What company did you say Timmy's father works for? I don't know. Timmy just said it's big and his dad has to work lots of hours. But his dad always makes time for him because he says family is the most important thing in the world. That afternoon, Susan made a decision that would have shocked her board of directors. She left the office at 3 p.m., not for a client meeting or a corporate function, but to spend time with her daughter. They went to the park where Lily talked more about Timmy, describing their friendship with the kind of detail that suggested she'd been starving for this kind of connection. His house isn't fancy like ours, Lily said as they walked along the path, but it feels more like a home. There are pictures everywhere, and you can tell people actually spend time together there. Susan listened with growing discomfort. Her penthouse apartment was a showcase of expensive furniture and minimal living. The walls held abstract art chosen by a decorator, not family photos. The kitchen was spotless because they rarely cooked meals together. Everything was beautiful and cold and empty of the kind of love Lily was describing in Timmy's modest home. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Susan found herself doing something she'd never done before. She opened Nexacorp's employee database not to check productivity metrics or approve budget cuts, but to search for families like Timmy's. She started with basic parameters, single parents in the warehouse division, and what she found made her stomach turn. The data told stories that her quarterly reports had never revealed. Dozens of employees working overtime shifts to support their families, their compensation recently slashed by policies she had approved without ever considering the human impact. She clicked through profile after profile, each one representing a family struggling to survive, while Nexacorp posted record profits. When she found Mark Henderson's file, something inside her broke. The employment photo showed a man with kind eyes and tired smile, someone who looked like he cared about doing good work. His record was exemplary: 7 years of perfect attendance, no safety violations, consistently high performance ratings. But his recent pay history told a different story. The overtime cuts Susan had approved 6 months ago had reduced Mark's monthly income by $387. For someone in her tax bracket, that was less than she spent on a single business dinner. For Mark Henderson, it might be the difference between keeping his home and losing everything. Susan opened his full file, her hands trembling as she read. Single father. Wife deceased from cancer. One dependent, Timothy Henderson, age 8. Emergency contact. Jefferson Elementary School. Timmy. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. This was Lily's friend's father. This was the man whose kindness and presence her daughter had been describing with such longing. Mark Henderson, the employee whose paycheck she had cut, was providing his son with everything she had failed to give Lily: time, attention, unconditional love. If you've ever realized that your success came at the cost of someone else's family, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to show you that it's never too late to make things right. Susan stared at the screen, her mind reeling with the implications. Mark Henderson worked at her company. His son was the boy who had shown her daughter what real friendship looked like. His family was struggling because of policies she had implemented to boost profits and impress shareholders who would never know or care about the human cost of their returns. She thought about Lily's description of their dinner conversations, of Mark showing up to baseball games despite working 12-hour shifts, of a father who made time for pillow forts and homework help even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. This was the kind of parent Susan had convinced herself she didn't have time to be. The irony was crushing. Mark Henderson, earning a fraction of her salary, was giving his son a childhood filled with love and stability. Susan, with all her wealth and success, had given Lily material comfort but emotional poverty. The man whose wages she had cut was a better parent on his worst day than she was on her best. Susan opened a new document and began typing. Not another cost-cutting memo or efficiency report, but something she had never written before, a proposal to restore overtime compensation and implement family-friendly policies that put people ahead of profit margins. Each word felt like an act of rebellion against the corporate culture that had consumed her life. As she worked through the night, Susan thought about Mark Henderson coming home exhausted to cook dinner for Timmy, to help with homework, to provide the kind of stable presence that no amount of money could buy. She thought about Lily sleeping down the hall, dreaming about a friend whose father showed up for him in ways Susan had forgotten how to do. The numbers on her screen, profit margins, cost savings, efficiency metrics, suddenly seemed meaningless. Compared to the image of Mark Henderson sharing a peanut butter sandwich with his son, of Timmy giving his lunch to a lonely girl, of small acts of kindness that created the kind of wealth no quarterly report could measure, Susan made a decision. That would change everything. She would find a way to meet Mark Henderson, to thank him for the lessons his family had taught her, and to prove that sometimes the most powerful people in a company could learn the most important truths from those they had unknowingly harmed. The transformation of Nexacorp would begin not with a board meeting or a policy memo, but with one CEO's realization that true success was measured not in dollars earned, but in lives touched, families supported, and children raised with love. Dawn was breaking over the city as Susan finished typing, her proposal complete, and her conscience finally clear. The corporate penthouse felt different that night. Susan Chin sat in her home office, the city lights twinkling 20 floors below, but for the first time in years, she wasn't focused on quarterly projections or market analytics. Lily's words echoed in her mind. Timmy's dad works really hard to take care of him, and family is the most important thing. Such simple wisdom from an 8-year-old, yet it had shattered something fundamental in Susan's worldview. She found herself staring at her laptop screen, cursor hovering over Nexacorp's employee database. She had never bothered to look at individual employee records before. That was HR's job, beneath the level of a CEO's attention. But tonight felt different. Her fingers moved almost without conscious direction, typing search parameters she had never used before. Single parents, recent compensation changes, warehouse division. The results populated with clinical efficiency, dozens of employee profiles, each one representing a family she had never considered. Martinez, Roberto, warehouse supervisor, 12 years of service, 3 children, recent overtime reduction, $347 monthly. Chun, David, materials handler, 8 years, 2 daughters, recent overtime reduction, $289 monthly. Henderson, Mark, distribution specialist, 7 years, 1 dependent, recent overtime reduction, $412 monthly. Susan's breath caught. Henderson. The photo showed a man with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who worked with his hands. His employment record was spotless, perfect attendance, exemplary safety. Ratings, multiple commendations for going above and beyond. Everything about his file screamed model employee. Everything except his recent pay history. The overtime cuts she had approved 6 months ago, part of a comprehensive operational efficiency package that had boosted quarterly profits by 18%, had slashed Mark Henderson's income by over $400 per month. For Susan, that was lunch money. For someone making warehouse wages, it could mean the difference between keeping the lights on and facing eviction. If you've ever realized your success came at someone else's expense, hit that subscribe button, because this CEO is about to learn what real leadership looks like. Susan clicked deeper into the system, accessing records she had never bothered to review. Employee assistance requests, emergency loan applications, hardship exemptions. The data painted a devastating picture. Dozens of Nexacorp employees, people who showed up every day to make her company profitable, were quietly drowning. Henderson's file contained an emergency assistance request submitted 3 weeks ago. Request for advance on earned vacation. Pay to prevent home foreclosure. The request had been denied due to insufficient tenure qualification. 7 years of perfect service wasn't sufficient tenured. Susan's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the data. The pattern was unmistakable. Single parents, long-term employees, warehouse divisions. The very people who formed the backbone of Nexacorp's operations were being systematically squeezed by policies she had implemented without ever considering the human cost. The irony was crushing. While she sat in her sterile penthouse, celebrating profit margins and efficiency metrics, Mark Henderson was probably lying awake calculating whether he could afford to keep his son's home. While she ignored Lily's attempts at conversation to focus on board presentations, this stranger was somehow managing to be the kind of present, loving father that her own daughter craved. Susan thought about Lily's glowing description of Timmy's family. The pillow forts, the shared lunches, the father who never missed a baseball game despite working exhausting shifts. Mark Henderson was giving his son everything that mattered, while Susan was failing to provide the one thing her daughter needed most. A mother who made time for what truly counted. The weight of unintended consequences settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Every efficiency improvement had a human face. Every cost-cutting measure represented families pushed closer to the edge. She had built her career on the mythology of shareholder value, never questioning whether success measured only in dollars was actually failure by every other metric that mattered. Her phone buzzed with another urgent email, but Susan ignored it. For the first time in her career, spreadsheets and profit projections seemed less important than the growing realization that she had become everything she had once sworn never to be. Memories surfaced unbidden. Herself at age 10, sitting alone in an empty house, while her own parents chased promotions and quarterly bonuses. She remembered the loneliness, the desperate hunger for attention that no amount of expensive gifts could satisfy. She had sworn that if she ever had children, she would be different. Yet here was Lily, 8 years old and starving for the same attention Susan had craved decades ago. The cycle had repeated itself despite all her promises, all her good intentions. Success had seduced her just as it had seduced her parents, convincing her that providing financial security was enough. Susan opened a new document and began typing. Not another efficiency memo or cost reduction strategy, but something unprecedented. A comprehensive policy reversal that would restore overtime compensation, expand employee assistance programs, and prioritize human dignity over profit margins. The financial projections were staggering. Restoring fair compensation would cost millions. The board would be furious. Shareholders would question her competence. But for the first time in years, Susan found herself considering a radical concept. Maybe some things were more important than quarterly earnings. She worked through the night, researching employee benefit programs, calculating the true cost of treating workers as human beings rather than resources. Each policy revision felt like an act of rebellion against everything she had been taught about corporate leadership. As dawn approached, Susan made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. She wasn't just going to implement policy changes. She was going to find Mark Henderson personally. She would look him in the eye, apologize for the harm her decisions had caused, and prove that sometimes the most powerful people in a company were the ones who remembered what truly mattered. Mark Henderson would go to work tomorrow expecting another day of struggle, another shift under the oppressive oversight of Mr. Johnson, another step closer to losing everything he had promised his late wife he would protect. He had no idea that his son's simple act of sharing a sandwich had changed the heart of the woman who controlled his fate, or that help was coming from the last place he would ever expect. Susan closed her laptop and walked to Lily's room, where her daughter slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of pillow forts and the kind of family love that Susan was finally ready to learn how to provide. The morning sun cast long shadows through the penthouse windows, illuminating a woman who had finally discovered the difference between success and significance, between efficiency and empathy, between being a CEO and being a human being. Change was coming to Nexacorp, and it would start with one man who deserved better and one little boy who had taught a powerful woman what really mattered through the simple act of sharing his lunch with a lonely girl. Monday morning arrived, with the weight of inevitability. Mark Henderson sat in his truck outside Nexacorp's main building, staring at the text message that had appeared on his phone at 6:47 a.m. Report to Executive Suite immediately upon arrival. S. Chun CEO. His hands shook as he read the words for the fifth time. In 7 years of employment, Mark had never been summoned to the executive floor. The only reason a warehouse worker got called to see the CEO was termination, probably for his confrontation with Mr. Johnson last week. The company was cutting him loose just when he needed the job most. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt like ascending to his execution. Mark's work boots looked out of place on the polished marble floors, his uniform shabby against the backdrop of expensive art and floor-to-ceiling windows. The receptionist's smile was professionally distant as she directed him to wait in a conference room that probably cost more than his annual salary to furnish. When Susan Chen entered, Mark's first thought was how young she looked to be running a company this size. Her second thought was confusion. This woman seemed nervous, almost as anxious as he was. "Mr. Henderson," Susan said, her voice softer than he'd expected. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." Mark remained standing, his cap clutched in his hands. "Ma'am, if this is about last week's meeting, I want you to know I respect this company. I was just trying to speak up for the guys who— Your son helped my daughter when I couldn't," Susan interrupted, her words stopping Mark mid-sentence. The statement made no sense. Mark blinked, trying to process what she'd said. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there's been some mistake. I don't understand, Timmy." He gave his lunch to a girl named Lily who had forgotten her lunch money. "They've become friends." Susan's voice carried a tremor that seemed impossible from someone in her position. "Lily is my daughter." The world tilted. Mark stared at this woman, this CEO who controlled his livelihood, and tried to reconcile her with the absent mother Timmy had described. "You're Lily's mom?" Susan nodded, her composure cracking slightly. "Lily talks about Timmy constantly, about how kind he is, how his father shows up for baseball games, how you have dinner together every night. She talks about your family with this longing, like she's describing something she's never experienced." Mark felt his defenses crumbling. Timmy mentioned Lily. He said she seemed lonely, that her mom worked a lot. "I've been a terrible mother," Susan said, the admission seeming to cost her everything. "I've given Lily everything money can buy, but I failed to give her what your son has, a parent who makes time for what matters." The vulnerability in her voice was so unexpected that Mark found himself sitting down without realizing it. "Mrs. Chun, I don't understand why you're telling me this." "Because I looked up your employee file. Because I discovered that the policies I approved to boost our quarterly profits have been destroying families like yours. Because your son's kindness to my daughter opened my eyes to what I've become." Mark's stomach dropped. She knew about the foreclosure, about his financial struggles. This was it. The moment when corporate efficiency would eliminate another inconvenient employee. "Mr. Henderson," Susan continued, "I need you to tell me about your situation. All of it." The request was so unexpected that Mark found himself talking before his caution could stop him. The words poured out. Emma's death, the medical bills, the promise to keep the house, the overtime cuts that had made survival impossible. He told her about the foreclosure notice, about lying awake calculating impossible mathematics, about the terror of explaining to Timmy that they might lose their home. Susan listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each detail. When Mark finished, silence stretched between them like a chasm. "How much do you owe?" she asked quietly. $3,200 in missed payments and fees," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "I have until Friday." Susan opened her desk drawer and pulled out a personal checkbook, not a corporate account, but her own. She wrote with deliberate care, then slid the check across the desk. Mark stared at the number, $35,000. Enough to clear his mortgage entirely. "I can't accept this," he whispered. "This isn't charity," Susan said firmly. "This is a mother thanking the father who taught her daughter what family looks like. This is a CEO apologizing to an employee whose dedication she failed to value. This is one human being helping another because it's the right thing to do." Mark's vision blurred as tears he'd been holding back for months finally escaped. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep being the father that Timmy deserves. Say you'll let Lily continue learning from your family what mine failed to teach her." 2 hours later, the warehouse floor buzzed with nervous energy. Word had spread that the CEO was coming down to address the workers personally, something that had never happened in Nexicorp's history. Mark stood among his co-workers, the check burning in his pocket like a secret he couldn't quite believe. Susan Shin stepped onto a makeshift platform, looking small but determined as she faced the sea of work-worn faces. Mr. Johnson stood to the side, his expression unreadable but tense. 6 months ago, Susan began, her voice carrying clearly through the warehouse. I approve policies that cut your overtime compensation by 20%. I was told this would improve our operational efficiency. What I failed to consider was the human cost of those decisions. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mark felt his co-workers shift beside him, uncertain whether this was good news or corporate doublespeak. Effective immediately, overtime compensation is restored to previous levels, retroactive to the date of implementation. Additionally, we're expanding our employee assistance program, implementing emergency financial support, and hiring additional staff to reduce mandatory overtime. The silence that followed was deafening. Then someone in the back started clapping, and the sound spread like wildfire until the entire warehouse erupted in cheers and applause. Join our community where small acts create massive change. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories of justice and hope.mr. Johnson's face had gone ashen. The cold efficiency model that had defined his management style had just been publicly rejected by the CEO herself. His era of treating workers as disposable resources was over. Mark found himself crying openly, not from despair, but from relief so profound it felt like resurrection. Around him, men who had worked in fear for months were celebrating like children, their dignity restored with a few sentences. That evening, Mark lifted Timmy onto his shoulders in their living room, their permanently secure living room, and spun in a slow circle. The foreclosure notice was gone, replaced by mortgage papers marked "Paid in Full." "Dad, you're acting weird," Timmy laughed, but his arms tightened around Mark's neck. "I'm just happy, buddy. Really, really happy. Is it because of work? You seem different since you came home." Mark set his son down and knelt to meet his eyes. "Timmy, do you remember when you gave Lily your sandwich?" "Yeah, she was sad and hungry." "Well, that one little act of kindness changed everything. Lily's mom learned about what you did, and it made her realize some important things. It changed our whole lives." Timmy considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds brought to life's mysteries. "So being nice to people really works?" "Being nice to people is the most powerful thing in the world," Mark said, pulling his son into a hug. "Your mom used to say that kindness creates connections we never expect. You proved her right." Across town, Susan Shun was tucking Lily into bed, a routine she had rediscovered after years of delegating bedtime to nannies and housekeepers. Tomorrow, she would pick Lily up from school personally. This weekend, they would visit Timmy's family for dinner. The corporate culture at Nexacorp would never be the same. One sandwich shared between children had revolutionized multiple lives, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest changes, and that true success is measured not in profit margins, but in the love we show each other when it matters most.